This one is, instead of an experiential activity like plus minus null, this is a dialogue-based activity. And like the last one, there are lots of similar activities that could be deployed for similar purposes. Basically, the point of these kinds of activities is storytelling, but storytelling at a deeper level, storytelling that that doesn't just stay at a surface sort of individual level, but taps into who people are as cultural beings. So as Hareen mentioned, thinking about backward design and always aligning back to the construct that we're trying to promote, the other aspect of openness beyond just suspending judgment and being open to different perspectives or interpretations of things, different ways of experiencing the world, is openness to actually interacting across those differences. And so this is the more interpersonal. The other one's a lot more cognitive and affective. And this one taps into the behavioral because we're asking people in these to actually engage with other people. And so it's dialogic, it's narrative, it's storytelling, and it's that personal side of openness where we're actually connecting in our humanity with other people. So, 5 Nosy questions. It's basically a set of discussion prompts, and again, we're not trying to do sort of very surface level things. We're really trying to inspire questions or discussions that tap into who people are as cultural beings. And it can be challenging sometimes because we don't want to promote stereotypes and we don't want to, have essentialism happening and overgeneralization. And so there's a balance to be found here in activities like this where we really have to frame our discussions as letting people be both individuals and members of cultural groups. So this particular activity is in the HubICL. Here's a couple of alternatives as well. But we're going to try out a demo. And so Dan, our tech host, is going to share a poll with you. And basically, Hareen and I, just for the sake of time, so we don't do breakout rooms, we're going to fishbowl this for you. So we're going to demo it. We have not practiced, I promise. And we're going to give you control over what we talk about. So if you will take that poll and choose one of these questions for Hareen and I to, to fishbowl for you, then we will give you a demo.
All right, which question one? Because I think I missed.
It looks like what do you most appreciate about the way you were raised is the winner at 31%. All right, so when you do dialogues, that's just to put the teacher's hat on for a second before we start. When you do a dialogue like this, framing is really important, and you really want to encourage people not just to ask and answer questions, but to actually talk to each other. And so if you can set this up as a dialogue, as a discussion where the prompt starts the conversation, but it doesn't just stop after the person has answered the question, that's best. And so that's what we're going to try to model here for you. So I'm going to start this off by asking Hareen the question, and then we'll go from there. So Hareen, what do you most appreciate about the way that you were raised?
Yeah, I think for me, I was raised in Jamaica in the Caribbean, and what I appreciate most is, especially in that context, was as a boy growing up in my household, I wasn't just allowed to go outside and play and do everything. So I also had to do housework. So I had to clean the bathrooms, wash the dishes, cook, all of those things. So it allowed me to develop those things, which was not always as common in my cultural context growing up. It would be sort of, there's this gender socialization happening where girls would stay in the house and boys would go outside and do the yard work. I had to do both. And as I got older, I appreciated that. And I joke with my wife that I have an excellent domestic CV, that I can do a lot of things around the house and both in the yard. What about you? How do you
That's awesome. Before I answer, I just have a quick follow-up question
Yeah, sure.
because it sounded like from what you said that was not very usual actually in the Jamaican context. So your friends, your peers were not kind of growing up that way with that skill set?
Yeah, not majority of my friends, guys were not in that similar environment. So I was able to take on a lot of responsibility in my household as a child, which was also not very common in the context. Sort of your parents sort of told you what to do and then you did it. And that was it. So in that context, I had a lot of autonomy and choice, which I still had to do what I was told, yes, but just over my overall development, which, yeah, I would say in my peer group and where I grew up, that was not common.
And so when you've spent a lot of time here in the US, you've been here for what, a decade or more, right?
Yeah.
So how do you find that compares with your peer group here?
Um, I think over time I don't know, that's a tough one. I'd have to think on that a little bit more. The comparison isn't as clear because, as I said earlier in the session, there have been moments where different parts of the US I experienced different things, and just the culture is so rich and vast, with the different ethnic and racial identity groups and so on, and how those socialization and family life are just so varied that I can't sort of pinpoint a sort of one-to-one. But yeah, it's
There is a
interesting.
lot of variation. So
I'm curious about Southern Georgia, Chris. Tell
well,
me.
your comments really resonated with me because I kind of had the opposite thing going on. I grew up in a military family. It's all girls in my family except my poor dad, like really totally outnumbered. So all girls that they had, and they fostered several girls, and then I have only girls. My sister has only girls. So just surrounded by women. And so anything that would in other maybe more typical US American households, working class and middle class households, would have been considered sort of boy things to do. We did all the time because there were no boys around. And so,
Yeah,
I learned to fly, and I can do anything construction related. I can do tile and plumbing and electrical work and,
yeah,
woodwork and all those kinds of things. I'm not a very good mechanic, um, but I can drive a tractor. So
yeah.
yes, I think the disruption of gender norms in the opposite direction was very much describes my family and the way that I was raised.
Okay, that's helpful. I know we have to end soon, but I'm curious to hear about this as a follow-up. Like, how did that experience in your family and what you've learned growing up around gender, how did that shape your worldview, your professional career, what you decided to do, what you do now? So,
Yeah, I think maybe not in terms of career choice, but in terms of how I perform my role in my career. I'm always very conscious of gender and sort of intentionally subvert or push back against gender norms that I encounter, not only because oftentimes it affects me in detrimental ways,
hmm
and so I'm resistant to that out of got my back up about it, but even for people that I mentor and even the gender norms that impact males in, I think, unfair ways, I push back against because of that early experience where um, they shouldn't be things that hold you back.
Yeah, nice. And scene.
All right, so we're going to debrief a little bit here. Let me share my screen again. Thank you for watching our demonstration so patiently. All right. Okay, so some debriefing prompts for you here. Let me get rid of my menu. There we go. Um, okay, so let's talk about your feelings. If you're willing to type into chat, any emotions that you experienced while you were watching this demo, or if you could put yourself in our place, what you feel like you might have experienced if you were actually performing in a dialogue such as this. Or you can put yourself in the place of your learners and describe how you think that your learners would feel participating in a dialogue like this. So anything related to emotions, we're just handling question number one right now. Anything with emotions, your own emotions, watching us, your own emotions imaginatively if you were participating, or your learners' emotions if they were participating. While you're thinking about that and typing, there's an excellent question in the chat about how much time to give people. And I would say minimum 1 minute per person per question. So if there are 5 questions and 2 people, you need 10 minutes. If there are 5 questions and 3 people, you need 15 minutes. Does that math make sense? And Harain, I don't know if you have a different formula that you use for things like this. That's bare minimum, by the way.
Yeah, I tend to go more time just because of the dialogue component and the opportunity to follow up. So I use a version something kind of called serial testimony, where you're intentionally practicing listening as well as part of this activity. Just being present so that you're not sometimes when you give students these things, they'll tend to be thinking about their answers. And even when we were preparing, I tried to not look at the questions to prepare an answer so it would be as natural and authentic as possible. So giving people time and the moments of pause. So I would probably go 2 to 3 minutes. And just a quick note on this, depending on the types of questions you end up asking, just being mindful of what it might invite people to bring up, reflection on childhood and so on. So you kind of have to leave space for that. And I like to, just so it's just not so much question and response, but there is space to unpack some things and for people to feel their emotions as they talk. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a great comment in here about people who've had childhood trauma. And I think you could give whatever you want to call it, a trigger warning or something in your framing that gets people to share as much as they're willing to share while engaging in self-care. So there are obviously things that nobody wants to talk about the way that they're raised or their cultural experiences. And there are also things that will bring up so much negative emotionality for them that it's not worth it for them to talk about it in that context. And so some sort of guidance for participants about how much they share or how much they think about particular things that come up for them in this activity would be wise. So we're kind of jumping down to the question number 3 here, but that was a good comment here.
In terms of structure, just addressing some of the things that I'm seeing in the chat, I think pairs are a good way to do this, especially people who are from different backgrounds, because earlier we were looking at suspending judgment, right? And this is an opportunity to practice initiating interactions with people who are culturally different. So, it's called 5 nosy questions, and the sort of, Chris and I were discussing sort of the level of this and the depth that it requires is just a little bit deeper, that we have to be very intentional about the types of questions, in terms of scaffolding it, what do students need to know? What other skills they need to develop, such as listening? You could also use the activity. You could also sort of scaffold it in a way where there is sort of 5 nosy questions light, where it's just general questions to start with to get things moving, and then get into more deeper questions. There are different ways to approach it, but being mindful of the structure and the framing, as Chris was saying, is a way to move forward.
Thank you for all these wonderful comments. I did put the time formula in there because we got a prompt about that. And again, that's my basic minimum. There's lots of variation on that for various contexts and contextual reasons. Let's move on for the sake of time to these second and third questions. I'm going to put the questions themselves back up here for you to think about that second question and the third question. So the second question is really like editing, because not all these questions are good all the time for all people in all settings, right? We really should tweak them in various ways, or not use them at all for various situations. But the third question is, what could you say to learners ahead of time to really set them up for success with this activity? So please feel free to share in chat any ideas that you have about editing questions or framing them well for participants. And meanwhile, let me go ahead and put the questions themselves back up for you. So one more time, the 2 questions are, how would you change the questions themselves? And how can you frame them for success? Frame the activity for success. Yes, good. Community agreements, wonderful. Yes, talking about stereotypes in a proactive, preventative kind of way would be great. Yeah, so there's a comment here about sort of introverted students or students who are feeling vulnerable for one reason or another. And this is one thing to think about when you put people together, both in terms of who you're putting together and the number of people that you're putting together. So sometimes a group of 3 might put a little bit less pressure on everyone to to talk more extensively. I think sometimes that's also difficult because you don't want two people to really feel like they have a lot in common and the third person not so much and be sort of otherized in that context. So there's lots of things to consider there, and there's no probably perfect solution to an issue like that. But I think the best thing to do is try to create the safest space that you can, and then encourage people to be brave within those safe spaces. So some of that is creating community amongst your learners before you even move into an activity like this. I love Aletha's idea of presenting choice. So you might say there's 5 questions here. You need to try to talk at least about 3 of them, and you can pass on things that you're not comfortable talking about or don't interest you. Yeah, great. Good comments. Yes, right. When people don't have necessarily a home community, um, I think there's probably a way to present these questions and set up the framing as you don't have to choose one culture to identify with whenever you're answering these questions. The point is to talk about yourself as a cultural being, which is probably very, very complex.